As you settle in tonight, letting the day's concerns gently dissolve, allow this quiet recounting of distant hours to accompany you toward rest. There is no urgency here, only the steady pace of time itself, moving through lives lived long ago. If these whispered histories help you find peace, consider following along for more. The world into which she was born was one measured not in years but in seasons, in the slow, inevitable rise and fall of the Nile. The heat of the Egyptian day would give way to evenings where the stone of the palace retained the sun's warmth, radiating it back into the cooling air. In those twilight hours within the complex of Alexandria, a child would have heard the distant sounds of the city settling, the call of merchants closing their stalls, the rhythmic lapping of harbor water against stone quays, the faint echo of Greek and Egyptian and Aramaic spoken in the streets below. This was the acoustic backdrop of a dynasty in its later years, a tapestry of normalcy woven around a center of immense, though fading, power. The palace itself was a city within a city, a series of interconnected rooms and courtyards where the business of court continued through bureaucratic routine. Scribes worked by lamplight long after sunset, their pens scratching across papyrus, recording grain yields, tax receipts, and diplomatic correspondence. The air in these rooms would be still, carrying the smell of ink and dust and the faint, oily scent of the lamps. A servant might move quietly along a corridor, adjusting a wick or carrying a message, his sandals whispering against polished stone. In the private quarters, the textures were softer, linen drapes, woven rugs, cushions filled with down. Here, the sounds from the city were muffled, replaced by the more intimate noises of a household. The soft click of a loom, the murmur of a tutor's voice, the rustle of a scroll being unrolled. For a young Cleopatra, education was not an abstract pursuit, but a physical, daily occupation. Hours were spent seated, back straight, learning to shape the complex characters of Egyptian hieroglyphs, a language no Ptolemy before her had troubled to master. The muscles in her hand and wrist would ache from the unfamiliar grip of the brush. There were breaks, of course, moments looking out from a balcony across the great harbor, watching the lanterns of ships bobbing like fallen stars on the dark water. She would learn the names of those ships, their ports of origin, the goods they carried. This knowledge was not merely academic. It was the pulse of the kingdom's survival. The library, that famed repository of all known wisdom, was not a silent tomb of scrolls but a place of quiet, perpetual motion. Scholars moved through its halls with a focused air, fetching texts, consulting with one another in low tones. The smell was distinct: papyrus, leather, cedar oil used to preserve the rolls, and the dry, earthy scent of parchment. A young mind navigating this world absorbed not just the content of philosophies and histories, but the weight of the physical objects themselves, the labor of their creation, the vast and quiet effort required to maintain a civilization's memory. Beyond the marble and granite of the royal quarter, Alexandria breathed with a life of its own. In the markets, as dawn broke, the first activities were not shouts but the quiet drag of stalls being arranged, the thump of amphorae being set on the ground, the splash of water as streets were washed down. Vendors arranged pyramids of dates and figs, stacks of woven baskets, bolts of linen from upriver. The conversations were practical about the quality of goods, the arrival of shipments, the price of grain. Sailors, bleary-eyed from a night in the taverns, made their way back to the docks, their movements slow and deliberate. The great lighthouse, its fire dimmed in the morning light, stood as a silent sentinel, its stone still warm from the night's vigil. In the countryside, the rhythm was dictated by the river and the sun. Farmers rose in the pre-dawn darkness, their bodies moving through well-worn routines, checking irrigation channels, tending to animals, preparing tools for the day's work. The air was cooler then, carrying the smell of damp earth and flowering lotus. As the sun climbed, the heat became a tangible presence, a heaviness that slowed all movement. Labor in the fields was a study in endurance, backs bent, sweat tracing paths through the dust on skin. There was a deep, mundane patience to it all, the waiting for the flood, the tending of seedlings, the slow ripening of crops. This was the Egypt that provided the wealth, the silent, endless labor that funded the politics and the wars. In the temples along the Nile, rituals followed a calendar older than the Ptolemies themselves. Priests performed ablutions in cold water before dawn, dressed in linen robes, and made offerings in dark, incense-heavy sanctuaries. The rituals were precise, the chants memorized, the movements deliberate. It was a world of routine sanctity, where the divine was approached through repetition and order. For a ruler, understanding this Egypt meant understanding the fatigue in a farmer's limbs, the precision of a priest's gesture, the patient calculations of a scribe. Power was not merely wielded from a throne. It was embedded in these countless, ordinary moments of maintenance and toil. The departure of a father into exile would have been preceded by weeks of uneasy tension within the palace walls. The atmosphere would grow thick with unsaid things. Courtiers spoke in lower tones. Glances between officials held unasked questions. The usual routines of court, audiences, petitions, feasts, would continue, but with a strained formality, like a play performed while the theater quietly burns. The news, when it came, would not have been a single dramatic moment but a slow dawning, a series of whispers confirming fears. Packing for exile was not a frantic rush but a grim, methodical process. What does one take when leaving home, perhaps forever? Certain scrolls, specific jewels, a favorite garment. The choices were practical and painfully symbolic. The journey itself was a lesson in dislocation. Travel by ship was a monotony of horizons, of sleeping in cramped quarters, of eating preserved foods. The body grows stiff, the mind weary from the lack of destination. Arriving in Rome, the sensory shock would have been profound. The different quality of light, the smell of a city built on hills without a great river, the cacophonous sound of Latin, a language harsh to an ear tuned to Greek and Egyptian. Observing Roman politics was not just about understanding alliances, but about noticing the physicality of it. The sweat on a senator's brow as he orated in the forum, the calloused hands of veterans gathered in the streets, the crumbling brick of tenement buildings behind marble facades. It was a world of stark contrasts, of brutal efficiency and grandiose decay. The experience of watching her father negotiate for restoration was an immersion in a particular kind of weariness, the fatigue of a supplicant. It involved long waits in anterooms, meetings that stretched into hours, the careful parsing of every word and gesture from Roman officials whose boredom was barely concealed. The return to Alexandria under Roman guard was a victory tinged with the metallic taste of dependency. The celebrations would have been bright and loud, but for a teenage Cleopatra, the quiet moments afterward would have been more telling. Looking out at the Roman ships permanently anchored in the harbor, their sails furled, their presence a constant, silent footnote to every subsequent decision. The daily reality of ruling, once she attained it, was largely administrative. Mornings often began with reports. Officials would stand before her, reading from scrolls in dry, factual tones. The numbers concerned grain stores, water levels at key points along the Nile, the readiness of garrisons, the movements of trade caravans. The room might be stuffy, the light from the high windows falling in sharp angles across the floor. A fly might buzz persistently against a pane. Her questions would be specific, probing for inconsistencies, seeking the reality behind the figures. After the reports came the audiences, a procession of petitioners, foreign envoys, priests seeking patronage for temple repairs. Each interaction required a performance of royal grace and attentiveness, a masking of any personal fatigue or distraction. The weight of the formal headdress, the diadem, could cause a dull headache by midday. In the afternoons, there might be consultations with military advisors, involving the examination of maps drawn on leather or papyrus. These showed coastlines, mountain passes, the locations of wells in desert regions. Tactics were discussed not as abstract concepts, but in terms of how many days a force could march without resupply, how much water a camel train could carry, how the winds typically shifted in the Aegean in autumn. Later, as the heat of the day began to wane, she might walk in the palace gardens. This was not mere leisure, but another form of observation. Gardeners would be at work, pruning, watering, tending to exotic plants gathered from across the known world. Their labor was another small system to be maintained. The evening brought correspondence, often written in her own hand. The act of writing by lamplight was a solitary one. The only sounds the scratch of the pen and the distant night sounds of the city. Letters to Antony, in particular, were exercises in layered communication, conveying necessary information, reinforcing alliance, managing a personal relationship, all through the formal medium of ink on papyrus. The language used was careful, the phrasing deliberate. A servant might enter to replenish the oil in the lamp, moving silently so as not to break the chain of thought. Night in Alexandria, from the palace, was a vista of darkness punctuated by scattered points of light. Fishermen's boats on the water, torches along the walls, the eternal flame of the lighthouse. The air would finally cool, carrying the scent of the sea. This was the hour when the burdens of the day could be set aside, not forgotten, but suspended in the quiet. The machinery of kingdom slowed, though it never fully stopped. Guards changed shifts on the walls, their footsteps a rhythmic, reassuring sound. In the harbor, night watchmen on the Roman vessels would call out the hour. This was the space between one day's labors and the next's, a time for the mind to wander, to consider the long view, the slow drift of history against which her own struggles were but a brief, intense episode. The alliance with Antony, the gathering of fleets, the movement of armies. These were the crescendos in a life otherwise composed of a million quiet, deliberate notes. The signing of a document, the listening to a report, the glance from a balcony at a familiar sea, the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge and power that happens not in the blaze of battle, but in the silent, persistent navigation of endless days. The great fleet that assembled was not an instantaneous creation, but the culmination of countless small, separate efforts. In shipyards from Phoenicia to Cyprus to the Delta, the work proceeded day upon day. The sound of hammers on wood was a constant percussion in those places, alongside the rasp of saws and the murmur of men calculating angles and stresses. The scent of fresh-cut timber, pine tar, and hemp rope hung heavy in the air. Each vessel began as a skeleton of ribs on a keel, growing slowly, plank by plank, caulked with pitched oakum. The men who built them worked with a focused, mundane diligence, their hands becoming rough and stained, their thoughts likely on the day's wage or the evening meal, not the grand strategy their labor would eventually serve. They took breaks when the sun was at its peak, sitting in whatever shade they could find, eating simple food, their bodies aching in familiar ways. This was the physical reality of power, the slow growth of a fleet measured in calloused hands and daily fatigue. Supplies were gathered with similar tedium. In granaries along the Nile, overseers watched as sacks were filled, weighed, and sealed. The air in these storehouses was thick with chaff and dust, making men cough. In armories, swords were inspected for flaws, their edges tested. Arrows were fletched by workers whose fingers moved with automatic precision, tying feather to shaft with endless, identical knots. The logistics were a form of quiet genius, a vast and uncelebrated puzzle of transportation and storage. Donkey trains carried loads overland to coastal depots. Barges moved material downriver. At each transfer point, there were inventories to check, tallies to dispute, delays to endure. The commander of such an enterprise had to think in terms of feet and inches, of daily consumption rates, of the wear on cart axles and the stamina of rowers. On the flagship, during the voyage toward Actium, life settled into the peculiar rhythm of a sea journey. The ship was a world unto itself, a floating microcosm of the wider coalition. The rowers, their benches arranged in tiers, worked in shifts, their synchronized pull of physical poetry that drove the vessel forward. The sound was a deep, rhythmic creak of oars and locks, the splash of blades in water, the exhalation of effort. They were not slaves, but professional crews, and their efficiency was a product of training and routine. On the deck above, Marines checked their gear, the quiet clink of metal on metal a constant undertone. They cleaned weapons, mended straps on their armor, played dice in small groups during rest periods. The tension before battle manifested not in shouted speeches, but in these quiet preparatory rituals. The tightening of a buckle one more time, the silent prayer to a personal deity, the gaze lost on the horizon. Cleopatra's presence on the flagship was a fact woven into the daily fabric. She would emerge from her cabin to walk the deck, not for dramatic effect, but to see and be seen, to maintain the connection between command and crew. She observed the condition of the sails, the set of the rigging, the demeanor of the men. Conversations with her captains were held in sheltered corners of the deck, out of the wind, spoken in low voices. They discussed wind patterns, the reliability of scouts, the morale of allied contingents on nearby ships. The meals were simple naval fare, hardtack, salted fish, a little wine mixed with water. The discomforts were universal. The constant damp, the cramped sleeping quarters, the pervasive smell of brine, sweat, and timber. Nights at sea were profoundly dark, the blackness of the water merging with the sky, broken only by the running lights of the fleet, a constellation of faint, bobbing stars. On such nights, the immensity of their undertaking felt most palpable. The fleet was a fragile community of wood and men, suspended on a vast, indifferent sea, moving toward a moment that would compress all this preparation into a few hours of chaotic violence. The days before the battle were spent in final, meticulous preparation. Ships were cleaned of unnecessary clutter. Combat stations were assigned and rehearsed. The great siege engines, mounted on reinforced platforms, were tested, their mechanisms oiled and checked. The thud of a practice shot hitting the water could be heard periodically across the fleet. Men sharpened blades. The whetstones scrape a ubiquitous, grating sound. There was a strange, suspended quality to this time. The work was urgent, yet the waiting was interminable. Men wrote last letters home which might never be sent. They exchanged small tokens with friends, a carved figurine, a coin from their hometown. The ordinary human need for connection persisted amid the war machinery. On the eve of battle, the routines intensified. Final briefings were held in lamplight below decks. The battle plan, with its signals and formations, was reviewed once more. Then came the order for rest. Few truly slept. Men lay in the dark, listening to the ship's sounds. The creak of the hull, the lap of water, the footsteps of the watch on the deck above. They thought of home, of family, of the simple pleasures of solid ground. For Cleopatra, this night would have been a culmination of a lifetime of such quiet vigils. The exiled princess waiting for dawn in a merchant ship's hold, the young queen listening to the sounds of a besieged palace, the ally contemplating the tangled politics of Rome. Now, the vigil was on a grander scale, but the essence was the same. A mind turning over possibilities in the dark, measuring courage against contingency, waiting for the world to reveal its next configuration. The morning of the battle broke not with fanfare, but with the ordinary procedures of a fleet coming to life. Cook fires were lit on sand-filled pans on the decks. producing small, smoky flames to prepare a meager breakfast. Men ate quickly, without conversation. The officers moved among them, offering quiet words, checking that each man was in his place. The sails, which had carried them through the night, were carefully furled and secured. In battle, they would be a hindrance. The oars were run out, the blades hovering just above the calm surface of the water. The silence was profound, broken only by the cry of gulls and the gentle knock of boats against each other in the light swell. Then, from the flagship, a series of flag signals broke the stillness. Horns answered from across the fleet, their calls echoing mournfully over the water. The sound was not thrilling, but functional, a signal to begin the final, deadly work. The oars bit into the sea as one, and the great armada began to move, not with speed, but with a terrible, deliberate slowness. The distance to the enemy line closed with agonizing gradualness. From a distance, Octavian's fleet appeared as a dark, jagged line on the water. As they drew nearer, details emerged. The glint of helmet and shield, the painted eyes on prows, the distinctive shapes of Roman quinquiremes. The air grew thick with the tension of imminent violence, a pressure felt in the chest. The last moments before engagement were spent in a final, personal silence. Men adjusted their grips on weapons, took deep breaths, made peace with their fate. The first action was not a crash, but the whistle of arrows in flight, darkening the sky before falling with a sound like rain on wood and water. Then came the heavier thump of catapult stones, some splashing harmlessly, others striking with terrible force, splintering hulls. The battle, when it was fully joined, dissolved into a chaos of individual struggles. The great strategies devised in council rooms gave way to the immediate demands of survival. The desperate pull on an oar to turn away from a ram, the heave of a grappling hook, the close quarters struggle on a blood-slicked deck. The noise was overwhelming. A cacophony of splintering wood, shouting men, clashing metal, and the screams of the wounded. For those in command, the view was both panoramic and frustratingly limited. They could see the larger movements of ships, the successes and failures of formations, but the smoke and confusion obscured as much as it revealed. Decisions had to be made based on partial information, relayed by breathless messengers from other parts of the line. The outcome often hinged on factors no plan could account for. A sudden shift in the wind, the failure of a single cable, the unexpected courage or panic of a single crew. In the aftermath, whether of victory or defeat, the immediate tasks were gruesomely practical. The sea was littered with wreckage and men. Ships with damaged hulls listed wearily. Others burned, sending pillars of black smoke into the sky. The cries of the wounded mingled with the shouts of rescuers. The living moved through a scene of exhaustion and shock, pulling survivors from the water, assessing what vessels could be saved, beginning the slow process of regrouping. The cost was counted not in grand terms of strategy, but in broken bodies, in the faces of friends who would not return, in the sheer, draining fatigue that followed extreme exertion. For Cleopatra, the return journey to Alexandria, regardless of the battle's result, would have been undertaken in a state of profound physical and mental weariness. The adrenaline of combat had drained away, leaving behind the dull reality of consequence. The ship moved more slowly now, perhaps bearing scars of the fight, patched hulls, torn rigging. The crew worked with the automatic movements of spent men. Night would fall again on the same sea, the same stars, but the world they returned to would be irrevocably altered. The routines of palace life would resume, the reports, the audiences, the quiet hours of administration, but they would now be performed under a different shadow, facing a new set of constrained possibilities. The great gamble would be settled, and the long, patient work of navigating its aftermath would begin. a process measured not in battles, but in the quiet, persistent passage of days and nights, in the endless effort to sustain a kingdom against the slow, inexorable pressure of time and change. The harbor of Alexandria would eventually reappear on the horizon, the lighthouse a familiar beacon. The city would receive its queen back into its bustling, ordinary life, its markets and temples and homes continuing their cycles unaware of the weight carried by those who returned. And within the palace, in the rooms that had known her since childhood, the lamps would be lit once more against the evening dark, casting long, silent shadows on the stone, as another day ended and the quiet work of the next one awaited. An unbroken chain of duty stretching back into the past and forward into an unknown future, where the only certainty was the coming of another night and the need for rest. The return to Alexandria, after such an immense expenditure of spirit and resource, was a journey into a deepened quiet. The sea, which had been a theater of fury, resumed its eternal, indifferent rhythm. The ships moved with a heavy languor, their crews nursing wounds both visible and unseen. The daily life aboard became a slow convalescence. Men sat in small groups, not speaking, their hands busy with the mindless tasks of repair, stitching torn sails, splicing frayed ropes, scrubbing dark stains from the deck. The work was therapeutic in its monotony, a way to keep the hands occupied while the mind processed what had been witnessed and done. The meals were the same as before, but consumed with less appetite. Sleep, when it came, was often fractured by dreams that caused men to start awake in the darkness of the hold, the echoes of battle still ringing in their ears. Cleopatra's cabin, a space of relative privacy, would have felt both a sanctuary and a cage. Here, the weight of outcomes settled most heavily. Reports would be drafted, casualty lists begun, dispatches to allies composed with careful, measured language that concealed the full extent of depletion or disillusionment. The act of writing by the light of a swaying lamp took on a new gravity. Each word committed to papyrus was a step in building the narrative of what had happened, a narrative that would need to sustain a kingdom's morale and justify its continued resistance or define its terms of accommodation. The view from the stern, looking back at the wake stretching toward the horizon, was a view toward a closed door. What was done was done. The future now was a blank page, waiting to be written by the reactions of others, by Octavian in Rome, by client kings in the East, by the people of Alexandria itself. The city, when it finally appeared, did not change to greet them. It was the same collection of white stone and bustling humanity, the same shimmer of heat on its paved streets, the same complex odor of salt, spices, and humanity. The arrival of the fleet was noted, of course. Crowds would gather on the quays, but their silence was more telling than any cheer. They watched the damaged ships limp into their berths, saw the weary, ashen faces of the men disembarking. News traveled through a city like Alexandria not in proclamations, but in whispers, in the concerned looks exchanged between merchants, in the way priests made additional offerings at the temple of Serapis. The palace absorbed its ruler back into its vast, cool interior. The routines reasserted themselves with a strange poignancy. The scribes were there with their scrolls. The chamberlain announced the day's schedule. The bath attendants prepared the scented water. These rituals of normalcy felt both essential and surreal, like dressing a profound wound with fine linen. The body continued its motions while the spirit lagged behind. In the days that followed, the strategic calculus was relentless. Intelligence networks, strained and damaged, had to be reknit. Messengers were dispatched to gauge the loyalty of border garrisons, the sentiments of regional governors. Treasury officials presented updated assessments, the numbers stark and unforgiving. The conversations with military advisors were no longer about grand offensives, but about defensible positions, choke points, the storing of supplies against a potential siege. The Grand Palace, with its views of the Mediterranean, became a fortress whose walls were being mentally measured for their ability to withstand assault. Yet, interspersed with these grave councils were the demands of a living city and a functioning court. A dispute between Greek and Egyptian guilds required arbitration. A request for funds to repair a damaged aqueduct in the upper city needed approval. The birthday of a younger child was observed with a small, private celebration, a brief island of familial normalcy in a sea of looming crisis. This juxtaposition was the essence of ruling in decline. The monumental and the mundane pressed relentlessly together. 1 hour was spent contemplating the final defense of a 3,000-year civilization. The next was given to deciding the design of a new coin issue. As the reality of the new political landscape solidified, the atmosphere in Alexandria shifted into a watchful, autumnal phase. The vibrant, cosmopolitan energy that had defined the city for centuries took on a subdued, waiting quality. Scholars in the library continued their work, but their debates were quieter, their eyes occasionally drifting to the harbor entrance, watching for unfamiliar sails. Merchants conducted business, but contracts were shorter term, investments more cautious. The great grain shipments continued to flow from the Nile Valley, but now everyone understood this abundance was what made them a target. In the countryside, the seasons turned without regard for politics. The Nile receded from its flood, leaving behind the rich, black soil. Farmers followed with their plows and seeds, their labor the same as their ancestors, a patient act of faith in the cycle of renewal. Their concerns were immediate: the price of seed, the health of an ox, the threat of locusts. The distant struggles of queens and Roman generals were as remote as the stars, affecting their lives only indirectly, through the level of taxation or the passage of foraging soldiers. This disconnect was itself a kind of historical constant, the vast silent majority whose labor supported everything, living in a parallel world of immediate physical needs. In the temples along the river, the rituals attained a new intensity. The prayers for the kingdom's safety were recited with greater fervor. The smell of incense was thicker, the chants more prolonged. The priests, custodians of a tradition that had seen empires rise and fall, performed their offices with a solemn dignity that suggested they were preparing not just for a political change, but for a spiritual transition, for the passing of their divine charge, the Pharaoh, into the care of the gods. For Cleopatra, the final period was likely one of intense, interior preparation. The political and military options narrowed with each passing week, each report of Octavian's consolidating power, each defection of a former ally. The grand diplomatic vision of a partnership of equals was receding, replaced by the stark geometry of siege and surrender. In such moments, leadership turns inward. There were undoubtedly councils of war, plans drawn for the defense of the city, attempts to rally the population. But there were also long periods of solitude. She would have walked the palace halls that housed the artifacts of her dynasty, portraits of earlier Ptolemies, gifts from foreign embassies, maps of a realm that had once stretched farther. She might have visited the tomb of Alexander the Great, a potent symbol of the Hellenistic world she was the last to fully embody. These were not acts of nostalgia, but of reconciliation, of placing one's own story within the longer arc. The nights were the longest. The city slept, or tried to. The silence of the palace was profound, broken only by the tread of the guards. In her chambers, the practicalities of final actions would have been considered with a cold, clear-eyed logic. The welfare of her children, the fate of her closest attendants, the means of denying an enemy a symbolic victory, these were the problems to be solved. The emotional tumult one might expect is often absent in such extremities, replaced by a fatigued clarity. The passions of a lifetime, the ambition, the love, the fury, the intellectual joy, have burned down to a steady, quiet flame, illuminating only the necessary next step. The stories that would later romanticize this ending overlook the profound ordinariness of its mechanics. The giving of final orders, the securing of documents, the simple physical acts of closing a door, of looking one last time at a familiar view, and then the arrival of the inevitable. Octavian's forces would not have appeared in a sudden, dramatic onslaught, but as a gradual presence on the horizon, a gathering of military might that methodically cut off avenues of escape and supply. The siege, when it began, was not a single event but a process of tightening. The bustling port grew quiet as the naval blockade took effect. The prices of food in the markets began a slow, steady climb. The sounds of the city changed, the normal din of commerce faded, replaced by the sounds of military preparation. The marching of citizen militias on the walls, the creak of siege engines being positioned, the distant, periodic shout of challenges between the lines. Within the palace, space itself seemed to contract. The world shrank to the reports from the walls, the dwindling levels in the grain stores, the anxious faces of the court. The grand rooms felt hollow. The magnificent mosaics underfoot were just stone. The final acts were, in their way, administrative. Dispositions were made. Certain loyal servants were given their freedom and means of escape. Final messages were sent, some to Octavian himself, negotiations of a personal and political nature conducted under the shadow of overwhelming force. These communications were exercises in a final, subtle diplomacy, an attempt to secure what could still be secured from the wreckage. The drama was in the waiting, in the slow tick of the water clock measuring out the last hours of an independent Egypt. The personal became indistinguishable from the political. The fate of the queen and the fate of the kingdom were one and the same. In the final quiet, before the outer world broke in, there was nothing left to plan, only to endure. The history of the Ptolemies, of Alexander's legacy, of pharaonic tradition stretching back to the pyramids, all of it narrowed to this point. A woman in a quiet room, the Mediterranean air still coming through the window, the sounds of a city holding its breath, and the immense, silent weight of time itself, ready to absorb the story as it had absorbed countless others, turning extraordinary lives back into the quiet stuff of history, to be whispered about on nights like this, when the present recedes and the past feels very close, a gentle murmur in the dark, inviting no conclusion, offering only the steady, rhythmic cadence of what once was, flowing on and on towards sleep. The tightening of the siege was not a dramatic event, but a gradual constriction, a slow suffocation of the city's vital functions. The first thing noticed by the common citizen was not the sight of enemy legions, but the quiet absence of the deep-drafted grain ships from upriver. The docks, usually chaotic with the unloading of harvests, grew still. The great warehouses, whose echoing interiors normally held the kingdom's insurance against famine, began to empty, their vast spaces echoing hollowly. The market chatter shifted from the price of goods to the availability of goods. Bread, that fundamental staple, became grayer, denser, mixed with barley and chaff. Lines formed before dawn at municipal bakeries, and the air in those lines was tense, silent save for the coughs and shuffling feet of a waiting populace. The color of the city changed subtly. The vibrant silks and linens of a prosperous trading hub were replaced by drabber, more practical wear. Gardens within the city walls were meticulously stripped of anything edible, leaf, root, and stem. The scent of blooming flowers was overtaken by the pervasive smells of crowded humanity, of smoke from countless small fires, of anxiety. The pulse of Alexandria slowed to a cautious, fearful beat. Within the palace, the grandeur became isolating. The vast audience halls were empty, their polished floors reflecting only the thin, high light from clerestory windows. The bureaucratic machinery that had governed a kingdom now governed a shrinking island of stone and mortar. Reports were no longer about provincial revenues or foreign trade, but about the daily ration, the status of the wells, the morale of the guard cohort stationed along the heptastadion. Meetings were held in smaller, more secure rooms. Maps on the tables were no longer of the Mediterranean world, but of Alexandria itself, its sewer conduits, its internal walls, its granaries. Strategy collapsed into logistics. The brilliant mind that had once negotiated with Caesar and planned the Battle of Actium was now consumed with the arithmetic of survival. So many mouths, so much grain, so many days. The intellectual pursuits of the court ceased. The scholars from the library were either gone or occupied with more immediate tasks. The poetry and philosophy that had once filled the air were silent, replaced by the low, urgent murmur of practical counsel and the grim clink of armor being donned and checked. For Cleopatra, these days were a masterclass in the erosion of power. Authority, which had once flowed from her across oceans, now extended no further than the outer palace gate. Her commands were executed, but with a grim finality, as if both she and her servants knew each order might be the last. She would make her rounds of the defenses, not as an inspiring figurehead, but as a final auditor, confirming with her own eyes what the reports told her. The faces of the soldiers were young and old, etched with the same grimy fatigue. Their salutes were weary. They did not look to her for victory, but for the dignity of their final stand. This acknowledgement passed silently between ruler and subject. In her private moments, the reality was one of profound disassembly. The treasures of the palace, the gold plate, the jeweled ornaments, the exquisite tapestries, were not objects of beauty, but assets. Some were secreted away in hidden caches, a futile hope for a future that would never come. Others were inventoried, their value calculated for potential use in last-moment bargaining. The process was methodical, devoid of sentiment. A civilization's accumulated luxury was reduced to weight and measure. Her children, the living symbols of dynastic fusion, were a constant, piercing concern. Their education stopped. Their world shrank to the innermost, most secure apartments. Their questions became harder to answer. The effort to maintain a facade of normalcy for them, a regular meal, a story before bed, was perhaps the most exhausting labor of all, a daily defiance of the crushing pressure beyond the door. Night in the besieged city was an entirely different entity. The curfew was absolute. The famous lighthouse still cast its beam, but now it swept over a dark, dead harbor and the watchfires of the encircling enemy. The silence was not peaceful, but watchful and strained, broken by the occasional call of a sentry or the distant, unsettling sound of Roman siege works progressing, the faint thump of a hammer, the scrape of earth being moved. In the palace, sleep was a fragmented, unreliable visitor. The mind, denied the distraction of daytime administration, turned over the same relentless calculations in the dark. Memories intruded, not as nostalgic comforts, but as sharp contrasts to the present reality. The glittering spectacle of her arrival at Tarsus, the scholarly debates in the library's halls, the feel of a sea breeze on the voyage to Actium. These were not regrets, but visitations from a life already feeling historical, as if she were reading her own biography while living its final, unwritten page. The physical discomfort was constant. The dull, permanent ache of stress in the shoulders, the dry mouth, the eyes gritty from lack of true rest. The body, like the city, was under siege. The final approach of Octavian's forces into the city itself would have been preceded by a peculiar, suspended silence after the last resistance faltered. The sounds of combat would cease, leaving an eerie quiet more terrifying than the noise of battle. Then would come the echoes of methodical occupation, the rhythmic tread of legionary boots on cobblestones, the shouted Latin commands, the battering of doors. The palace, the final redoubt, would become utterly quiet. The few remaining servants and guards would move like ghosts, their eyes wide, waiting for the inevitable breach. In these ultimate moments, time would seem to distort, stretching and compressing. The sunlight falling across a familiar mosaic pattern would feel impossibly vivid, each color intensely itself. The sound of a fountain in an interior courtyard would be acutely clear, each droplet distinct. This hyper-awareness is the mind's final, raw engagement with the world before letting go. All the political complexities, the strategic gambits, the alliances and betrayals would collapse into a simple physical finality. The long story of the Ptolemies, their Greek ingenuity layered over Egyptian immortality, their grandeur and their decadence, their scholarship and their intrigue, would funnel down to this single quiet point in a room. The Mediterranean world was shifting on its axis outside, moving from the era of Hellenistic kingdoms to the imperial age of Rome, a transition that would define centuries. But inside, the transition was intimate, personal, and utterly silent. It was the closing of a ledger, the final notation in an account of power maintained for 300 years through brilliance, adaptation, and sheer force of will. And then the stillness. Afterward, the city would continue because cities always do. The Romans would march through the Canopic Way, their standards bright against the white stone. The administrative takeover would begin with dry efficiency. Censuses, property assessments, the installation of a prefect. The library and the Mouseion would be spared, but henceforth they would operate under new patronage, their intellectual currents subtly redirected to flow toward Rome. The grain shipments would resume, now feeding Italy. The fishermen would mend their nets and return to the sea, which knew no masters. Farmers would again bend to their work in the Delta, their lives touching the great political events only in the form of a new tax collector with a different accent. The story of Cleopatra VII Theophilopator would quickly pass from current event into legend, then into myth, distorted by Roman poetry and political need. Her complexity flattened into a tale of ambition and seduction. The woman who spoke 9 languages, who debated philosophers, who commanded fleets and managed a kingdom's intricate economy, would be remembered for a snake and a couch. But in the quiet hours, in the spaces between the grand narratives, the reality of her reign persists, not in the dramatic climax, but in the million mundane moments that composed it. The scratch of a pen on a tax decree, the silent observation of a harbor's activity, the weary consideration of a scout's report, the patient explanation of policy to a skeptical advisor, the lonely weight of a diadem at the end of a long day. It was a life of immense, sustained effort, a continuous act of holding a complex and fragile world together against relentless pressure, until, finally, the pressure exceeded the strength of the vessel. And in that final yielding, there was not an ending, but a transfer of stories, of memories, of historical consequence, into the slow, deep currents of time, where they drift like silt from the Nile, settling into layers upon layers of other such lives, other such efforts, all waiting to be gently disturbed by the quiet inquiry of a listening mind. In the dark, on a night like this, as the present slowly dissolves and the whispers of the past rise up, not to conclude, but simply to continue. Their endless, murmuring flow, a soft and seamless background to the gradual descent into silence and sleep. The days following the final silence in the palace unfolded with the subdued, practical rhythm of an occupied city. The ordinary life of Alexandria, which had been held in breathless suspension, began again, tentatively, under a new and unfamiliar cadence. Roman soldiers appeared at street corners not as ravaging conquerors, but as administrators of order, their presence a constant, low-grade reminder of transition. The markets reopened, though the goods were different. More Roman pottery, Italian wines, fewer of the exotic spices from the East that had once flowed so freely. The chatter in the agora was in Greek still, but interspersed with Latin military terminology and the coarse banter of legionaries on leave. The process of erasing one sovereignty and imposing another was not marked by grand destruction, but by 10,000 small adjustments. Statues of the Ptolemies were not toppled in fury, but quietly removed from their pedestals in the dead of night, to be replaced in due time by effigies of Augustus. The work was done by city laborers, not soldiers, their hammers and chisels sounding a dull, percussive counterpoint to the usual city noise. The physical fabric of the city endured, but its spirit was being meticulously edited. In the royal quarters, now emptied of their ruling presence, a different sort of work commenced. Roman clerks, accompanied by junior officers, conducted a thorough inventory. They moved from room to room with wax tablets and styluses, their movements efficient and dispassionate. They noted everything: the number of gold cups in a cabinet, the weight of silver plates, the quality of tapestries, the contents of the royal library's lesser annexes. Their interest was fiscal and logistical. The history and sentiment embedded in these objects were irrelevant to their tally. A child's wooden toy, left behind in a corner, would be picked up, examined for material value. Was it inlaid with ivory? And then set aside in a pile of negligible items. The famous collections of exotic animals in the royal gardens were catalogued as assets. The fate of Cleopatra's children was determined in clean, administrative language in documents that would be filed away in Rome. These were not acts of malice, but of bureaucratic finality. The mechanism of empire was absorbing the assets of a client kingdom, and the process was devoid of the drama that had characterized that kingdom's end. The heat of the Egyptian sun still warmed the marble floors these men walked upon, but the human warmth that had defined the spaces was gone, leaving only an echoing, empty grandeur. Beyond the palace walls, the intellectual heartbeat of the city, the great library and the Mouseion, entered a period of uneasy transition. The scholars, philosophers, and scientists who remained were a pragmatic lot. Their work had always been supported by patronage, and now the patron had changed. Some departed for other centers of learning, to Rhodes, to Athens, to Pergamum. Those who stayed did so for love of the institution itself, or for the unparalleled collections, or simply because they had nowhere else to go. Their daily routines continued. Mornings in the scriptorium copying texts, afternoons in debate in the shaded colonnades. But the topics of discussion subtly shifted. There was less speculative philosophy about ideal forms of government, and more applied mathematics and geography that might be of use to the new administration. The freewheeling, cosmopolitan intellectual atmosphere, fueled by Ptolemaic ambition, began to cool into something more utilitarian, more aligned with the Roman genius for practical application. The scrolls remained, but the context around them had irrevocably altered. Meanwhile, the immense bureaucratic apparatus of Egypt, the very system Cleopatra had worked so diligently to master and control, proved to be the most durable legacy of all. The Roman prefect Cornelius Gallus and those who followed him discovered that to govern the fertile, populous land of the Nile, they had to sit in the same chair, use the same system of scribes, and rely on the same complex knowledge of flood patterns, crop cycles, and grain storage. The Egyptian priests, the village headmen, the tax collectors, these intermediaries remained in place. They simply reported to a different name at the top of the scroll. The continuity was astounding. The peasant in a village near Thebes, tilling his field with a wooden plow identical to his great-grandfather's, would have noticed little difference. The tax demand might come with a new seal, but the amount, calculated on the height of the Nile flood, was determined by the same ancient formulas. The rhythms of birth, marriage, harvest, and death proceeded with the indifferent pace of the river itself. The great political earthquake that had ended a dynasty was, for the majority of Egyptians, a distant rumble, felt only as a slight, almost imperceptible tremor underfoot. Octavian, now Augustus, returned to Rome not just with the wealth of Egypt, but with a powerful new narrative. Cleopatra's story was carefully reshaped into a foundational myth for the nascent empire. The complex, politically astute queen was distilled into a simple archetype, the dangerous, decadent Oriental other, against whom Roman virtue had heroically defined itself. The poetry of Virgil and Horace would cement this image, turning a nuanced life into a moral and political allegory. The real woman, the polyglot administrator, the naval strategist, the last defender of her kingdom's autonomy, was buried under layers of propaganda. Her children were paraded in Rome's triumph, then quietly dispersed into obscurity, their potential as living bridges between worlds extinguished. The treasure of the Ptolemies was poured into the building of temples and roads in Italy, its origin forgotten by those who benefited from it. The assimilation was total, and yet, in the quiet of night, in the empty halls of the Alexandria palace now used as a Roman governor's residence, perhaps a trace of the past lingered. A servant, lighting lamps along a corridor, might feel an uncanny chill, a presence in a room where no one stood. The scent of a particular incense, used by the royal household, might inexplicably waft through a window on a still evening. These are the ghostly residuals of ended things. Not spirits, but echoes of intense human energy pressed into stone and memory. The Mediterranean world moved on, consolidated under the Pax Romana. Trade routes became more secure, pirates were swept from the seas, and a common legal framework stretched from Spain to Syria. The vibrant, competing Hellenistic kingdoms were gone, their energy now channeled into the single, sprawling entity of the empire. The age of charismatic individual rulers like Cleopatra, playing the great game of nations with their own personalities and intelligence as capital, was over. The future belonged to systems, to legions, to legal codes, and to emperors who ruled from a distant city on the Tiber. But the story of that ending queen does not conclude. It merely dissolves into the substrate of history. Her intelligence becomes a cautionary tale about the perils of ambition in a woman. Her political acumen is recast as cunning. Her multilingualism is forgotten. What remains for later centuries is the silhouette, not the substance. Yet, in the long, slow hours of the night, when the mind unwinds from the demands of the present, it is not the silhouette that fascinates. It is the texture of the lost reality, the feel of papyrus under her fingers as she reviewed a tax report, the specific quality of the light in her council chamber in late afternoon, the weight of the decisions made in that room, the fatigue after a day of performing sovereignty, the private silence that followed the public audience. It is the sheer, grinding work of it all, the unglamorous, perpetual labor of maintaining a civilization's flame against the constant draft of time and fortune. This is the part of history that never makes the monuments, but which is the true substance of any reign. The accumulation of days, the management of minutiae, the bearing of solitary responsibility. As the night deepens now, and the distant sounds of the present world fade, that older, quieter reality seems to press closer. Not as a drama to be resolved, but as a steady, murmuring presence, a testament to the endless human endeavor to impose order on chaos, to protect what is valued, and to persist with intelligence and will until the moment persistence is no longer possible. And in that recognition, there is a kind of peace, a connection across the centuries not to glory or tragedy, but to the shared, fundamental experience of effort, and to the deep, velvety silence that eventually comes to gather up all effort, all story, into its boundless, quiet hold. The Roman administration of Egypt settled over the land like a fine, inescapable dust. It did not smother, but it coated everything, altering its color and texture. In Alexandria, the Prefectus Aegypti took up residence not as a pharaoh, but as a senior bureaucrat of immense power. His concern was not the glory of the kingdom, but the efficient extraction of its wealth. The grain fleet to Rome became a sacred, non-negotiable operation, its timing and tonnage dictated by imperial needs rather than local conditions. The scribes who had once tallied harvests for the royal granaries now tallied them for the annona, the Roman grain dole. The numbers were the same, the papyrus was the same, but the ultimate destination of the figures had shifted west, to the banks of the Tiber. The great lighthouse continued its nightly vigil, but it now guided ships that were part of a Mediterranean system policed by the Roman navy, their cargoes destined to feed a populace whose political stability depended on full bellies. The city's famous cosmopolitanism persisted, but it was now framed within the imperial hierarchy. Roman citizens at the top, then Greeks and Hellenized Egyptians, then the native majority. The friction was not in open revolt, but in the countless minor humiliations of daily life. A Roman official's impatient dismissal of a Greek petition, a centurion's brusque command in the marketplace. Out in the nomes, the ancient districts of Egypt, life persisted in its seasonal round. The Roman tax collector, often a Greek or Egyptian himself operating under Roman authority, arrived with his guard and his ledgers. The peasant family stood before him, their heads bowed, as he consulted the census rolls and calculated their due based on the height of the nilometer's marking. The transaction was conducted in Demotic Egyptian or Greek. The coins exchanged were often Ptolemaic issues still in circulation. The physical reality of the exchange, the weight of the grain sacks, the feel of the coins, the dust of the threshing floor, was unchanged for 1,000 years. Only the insignia on the receipt was new. The temples, those bedrock institutions of Egyptian life, found a modus vivendi with their new masters. The Roman prefects, following Augustus's policy, assumed the pharaonic role of temple patron and high priest in iconography and ceremony. They made offerings to Isis and Osiris. Their names were carved in hieroglyphs within cartouches on temple walls, performing the rituals of kingship for a people who understood power through that divine lens. It was a brilliant, pragmatic absorption. The priests, guardians of tradition, played their part, legitimizing the new ruler in exchange for the preservation of their lands and rights. The profound, cyclical rituals of death and rebirth continued in the deep, painted sanctuaries, the chants rising through stone corridors as they always had, now for the benefit of a distant emperor who likely never thought of the god Serapis at all. Back in Rome, the spoils of Egypt fueled a transformation of the city itself. The captured wealth paid for new aqueducts, temples to the deified Julius and Apollo, public baths, and roads. When an ordinary Roman citizen walked through the newly paved forum, admired the marble facades, or collected his monthly grain ration, he was benefiting directly from the end of a kingdom he likely understood only as a place of fabulous luxury and dangerous seduction. Cleopatra's fate was a story told to children, a moral fable about the dangers of the East and the virtue of Roman discipline. Her image, captured in paintings and descriptions, became a shorthand for exotic, threatening decadence. The realpolitik of her alliances, her desperate fight for her kingdom's autonomy, her intellectual court, all of this was irrelevant to her utility as a conquered symbol. The poets Propertius and Virgil did not write of her administrative reforms. They wrote of the whore queen and the fatal monster, literary cement for the political foundation of Augustus's reign. The woman was erased, the archetype installed. And yet, in the quiet of the Alexandrian night, long after the last Roman clerk had snuffed his lamp, something of the old pulse remained. It was in the very stones of the city, in the layout of streets designed by Dianocrates for Alexander, in the hidden foundations of buildings that had housed generations of scholars. It was in the persistent dialect of the Egyptian language spoken in the back alleys far from the Greek and Roman quarters. It was in the secret veneration of the old royal cults in household shrines. History's overt narrative is written by the victors, but its substrate is made of these persistent subcurrents. the habits, the words, the unspoken loyalties that flow beneath the official story, slowly shaping it from below. The Roman Empire would come to rely on Egyptian grain for centuries. The cult of Isis would sweep through Rome itself, becoming one of the most popular mystery religions, a quiet cultural counter-invasion. The knowledge preserved in the library, though diminished, would be copied and recopied, passing into the Arabic world and eventually back to Europe. For the listener now, drifting in the dark, the significance lies not in the pivot of history, but in the contemplation of aftermath. The drama is over. The legionaries have stacked their arms. The scribes have filed their final reports on the Ptolemaic assets. The queen's children are grown, living out obscure lives under other names. What remains is the echo and the slow geological settling of events into layers of time. Think of the palace years later. A Roman official's wife from Campanian might stroll through a garden planted with exotic specimens from the upper Nile, complaining of the heat. She would have no idea that the garden's design was commissioned by a woman who spoke the language of the men who gathered those plants. In the countryside, an old farmer, his face a map of wrinkles drawn by sun and wind, might tell his grandson a garbled story about a great queen of old, while they mend a fishing net by the riverbank. The story would be wrong in every detail, but it would carry the emotional truth of a lost world. The night is vast, and it contains all these silent endings and continuations. The effort of a single life, however extraordinary, is like a stone dropped into the sea of time. The splash is momentary, visible only to those nearby. Then the ripples expand, growing wider and fainter, until they are imperceptible, becoming merely part of the sea's general motion. The stone itself sinks through the dark water, coming to rest on a bottom littered with countless other stones. That is where history truly resides. Not in the splash, but in the quiet resting place, in the accumulated sediment of human endeavor. The tale of Cleopatra is not a lesson, nor a warning, nor a tragedy in the classical sense. It is simply a particularly vivid stone, its contours still discernible if one cares to look down through the depths. And as you lie here, suspended between waking and sleeping, your own consciousness like a slow current moving over that sunken landscape, you can feel the shape of it. Not the glittering surface it once presented to the sun, but the solid, cool reality of its weight, its endurance in the deep, quiet dark. The narrative need not progress. It is enough that it exists, a solid fact in the fluid darkness, a touchstone for the mind as it releases its grip on the day and prepares for the formless journey of the night, where time collapses and all stories are present, humming just below the threshold of hearing, a gentle, endless murmur. Centuries are not experienced as centuries. They are felt as the gradual weathering of a stone step, the slow silting of a canal, the incremental shift in the style of a potter's design. 100 years after the Roman prefect took up residence in the palace, the routine was so entrenched it felt eternal. The annual grain fleet's departure for Ostia was a civic event in Alexandria, but one devoid of passion. It was a tax season, a meteorological calculation, a logistical puzzle. The officials who oversaw it thought in terms of tonnage and sailing schedules, not in terms of a kingdom's lifeblood being siphoned west. In the offices where they worked, the ghosts of the Ptolemaic administrators were not ghosts at all. They were predecessors whose filing systems had been logically adopted and improved upon. The past was not haunting, merely foundational. In the countryside, a farmer's great-grandson now worked the same plot of land. The stories he heard from his grandfather were not of Cleopatra, but of the great flood of his grandfather's youth, or the year the locusts came. The queen belonged to a different category of time, to the Old Kingdom time, which included the pharaohs who built the pyramids, a misty, undifferentiated past of giant figures and magic. Her reality had dissolved into the archetypal. The city itself underwent a slow metamorphosis. New temples were built, dedicated to Roman emperors and the Capitoline Triad, their architecture a fusion of Greek proportion and Roman concrete strength. But they were built around the existing street plan. The tomb of Alexander the Great remained a site of pilgrimage, now for Roman tourists as much as for local devotees. A guide would recite a standardized history, mentioning the Ptolemaic kings as a list of names, their achievements and follies condensed into single, moralizing sentences. Cleopatra's would be the last, the cautionary capstone. The listener, a merchant from Gaul or a soldier's wife from Hispania, would nod, try to picture it, then move on to the next site, the heat and the strange smells beginning to induce a dull headache. The past was becoming a spectacle, its raw edges smoothed by the repetitive friction of storytelling. In the quiet of the library, now under imperial patronage, the work of preservation continued, but the urgency of expansion had faded. The great era of acquisition was over. Now the task was conservation, copying decaying texts onto fresh papyrus or the newer, more durable parchment. A scholar might spend a year meticulously reproducing the works of a philosopher who had once walked these same halls. His world was the world of the text. The consistency of the ink, the exact formation of a letter, the correction of a copyist's error from a century prior. The political storms that had swirled outside these walls when the text was written were irrelevant to his task. He worked by the light of an oil lamp, his back aching, his eyes strained, preserving a thought as a jeweler might reset a gem, indifferent to the original crown from which it came. In this way, the intellectual legacy of Hellenistic Alexandria was slowly, painstakingly detached from its source, made portable and neutral, ready for transmission to other times and places. Meanwhile, the cult of Isis, which Cleopatra had so powerfully embodied in her final role as the new Isis, escaped its political confines entirely. It traveled in the holds of ships, in the packs of merchants and soldiers, to ports across the empire. In Rome itself, on the Campus Martius, a temple to Isis was established. Its rituals, the morning liturgy, the sacred ablutions, the offering of milk and flowers, were performed not by Egyptian priests, but by Romans and Greeks who had been initiated into the mysteries. The goddess had outlived her last great earthly avatar. She was no longer the protector of a specific kingdom, but a universal savior, offering redemption and eternal life to any who sought her. A worshipper in Pompeii, praying before a fresco of the goddess in her home shrine, felt no connection to Ptolemaic politics. She sought comfort for a sick child, or hope for the afterlife. The power that had once been channeled through a pharaoh was now diffused, democratized, and infinitely more resilient. And what of the memory of the woman herself? Fractured. In some Egyptian priestly traditions, maintained in temple hinterlands, she persisted as a legitimate, if final, pharaoh, her name in cartouches still ritually cleansed. In Roman histories, she was a set piece in the story of Augustus's rise. In popular gossip and mime shows, she was a figure of sensational luxury and erotic danger. There was no single Cleopatra. There were countless shards, each reflecting the needs and prejudices of the holder. The coherent, intelligent, strategically desperate person was unrecoverable. She had become a resource, a symbol to be used. This, perhaps, is the final fate of all who live at such a pitch, to be dismantled by time and utility, their complexity traded for symbolic potency. The desert beyond the Nile's fertile strip watched all of this with the same impassive gaze it had turned upon the pyramid builders. The sands shifted, swallowing outposts, then revealing them millennia later. The wind carved the faces off statues. The climate did not change. The stars that had guided her ships from Actium still turned in their immutable courses. The Mediterranean, which had been the stage for her ambitions, continued its blue, indifferent exchange of waters. This is the deep, calming truth that lies beneath all human history, the brevity of our arrangements against the patient, physical permanence of the world. Our empires are fleeting tensions on the surface of a much deeper, quieter existence. As you drift now, let that deeper existence rise. The specific details, the names, the dates, the battles, are already softening at the edges, blending into a more general impression of effort and twilight. What remains is the sensation of a cool marble floor underfoot in a silent hall, the smell of papyrus and dust, the weight of a linen robe, the ache of fatigue behind the eyes after a long council, the sound of distant water against stone. These sensory ghosts are the true residue of history, not the chronicles. They are what connect our present solitude to all the solitary moments that have preceded it. The night is long, and it contains not just this story, but the space for all stories to unwind, to lose their narrative urgency, and to simply be present as a quiet hum in the darkness, a vibration from the deep past that resonates gently with the quiet of this room, the rhythm of your breath, the gradual slowing of thought, until there is no distinction between the story being told and the state of listening, only a continuous, soft, dark silence, ready to receive the next whisper from the past or the next in an endless, gentle, untroubled succession. The passage of time in a land as ancient as Egypt is measured not in the rise and fall of dynasties, but in the slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of dust. In the corridors of the palace at Alexandria, now the praetorium of the Roman prefect, that dust settled in the still air of rooms no longer used for their original purpose. A storage chamber, once perhaps holding the ceremonial robes of a Ptolemaic festival, now contained cracked tablets listing provincial census data from the reign of Tiberius. The light from a high, narrow window would fall across these stacks, illuminating motes that danced in the beam, the only movement in the quiet. A Roman functionary, searching for a particular record, would disturb the sleep, his fingers leaving trails in the fine layer of silt on the tablet's wooden cover. His mind was on the missing document, not on the room's previous occupants. The past was not a presence here. It was merely displaced material, pushed aside to make room for the ongoing, pressing business of administration. The weight of history was not felt as grandeur or tragedy, but as a slight inconvenience, a need to clear out older files to make space for the new. Beyond the city, the Nile performed its eternal, silent labor. The flood's arrival was anticipated not by priests interpreting divine signs for a pharaoh, but by teams of engineers and scribes who monitored Nilometer readings with pragmatic focus. Their reports were concise, numerical. A rise of so many cubits meant a harvest of such and such volume, which translated into a specific tax yield. The mystery had been drained from the cycle, replaced by a complex but predictable hydraulics of empire. The farmers, of course, still prayed. They left small offerings at the shrines of Hapi, the god of the inundation, as their ancestors had. Their relationship with the river remained intimate, fearful, and reverent. They felt its mud between their toes, drank its water, knew its moods. The Roman tax demand was an abstract, annual pressure. The river was the concrete source of life and death. Their world was this duality: the immediate physical reality of the land and the distant paper reality of the authority that claimed its fruits. In Rome itself, the image of the conquered queen had been polished into a flawless narrative gem. It was displayed in rhetoric and art as a trophy of virtue. A patrician boy reciting his lessons would learn of her as the embodiment of luxuria and superbia, vices overcome by Roman virtus and pietas. The lesson was not about Egypt, but about Rome. She was a fixed point in the moral cosmos, a negative example against which the Augustan order defined itself. Any residual truth, her political acumen, her linguistic skill, her desperate defense of her kingdom's autonomy, was an irrelevant complication. The person was gone. The symbol was eternally useful. In a wealthy Roman's villa, a mural might depict her death, stylized and serene, a decorous end to a decorous moral tale. It was art as furniture, a comfortable affirmation of the world as it now was. Meanwhile, in the back streets of Alexandria, in the homes of the Egyptian scribe class who still managed the lower tiers of bureaucracy, a different memory might flicker. A father, teaching his son the complex demotic script, might mention, almost in passing, that the last ruler who could read this as a living language was a queen, a Greek by blood but an Egyptian in her diligence. It would not be a statement of rebellion or nostalgia, but a simple fact of linguistic history, a footnote to the main task of ensuring the boy could secure a stable post in the records office. The memory was stripped of passion, a minor historical curiosity, like remembering an old, discontinued coinage. This is how the profound becomes ordinary, not through rejection, but through the gentle, relentless erosion of context. The weather of the Mediterranean continued its patterns. The Etesian winds still blew from the north in the summer, cooling the Alexandrian coast. Sailors still used them as they always had to make their passages. A ship captain from Cyprus, hauling olive oil to the Egyptian capital, gave no thought to the naval battles those same winds had witnessed decades earlier. His concerns were the price of his cargo, the integrity of his sails, the temperament of the Roman port official he would have to bribe. The sea was a workplace, its history irrelevant to its daily use. The lighthouse at Pharos still burned its beacon, now maintained by imperial funds. Its keeper, a grizzled man whose father and grandfather had likely held the same post, climbed the spiral ramp nightly to tend the great fire. He looked out at the same expanse of dark water, but his thoughts were on the quality of the fuel, the clarity of the lens, the wear on the pulley ropes. The past was a silent companion to his routine, unseen and unmentioned, and so the story diffuses. It loses its shape, like ink dropped in still water. First a coherent cloud, then tendrils, then a faint, uniform tint that eventually becomes indistinguishable from the water itself. The fierce concentration of a life, of a reign, of a culminating crisis, is subject to this inevitable diffusion. The archives crumble. The eyewitnesses die. The motives are guessed at, then simplified, then fictionalized. The palaces are repurposed, the tombs looted, the statues recarved with new faces. What remains is not the event, but the atmospheric change it left in the world. A slight shift in trade routes, a new administrative term borrowed from Greek, a vague cultural anxiety or fascination with the East that would echo for centuries in the Western mind. For you, lying in the dark now, the chronology is no longer important. The sequence of events dissolves into a landscape of feeling and image. It is the feeling of a final, quiet room. It is the image of a scroll sealed for the last time. It is the sound of a distant gate closing. It is the weight of a diadem placed on a table, not to be worn again. It is the coolness of a jewel against the skin in a hot room. It is the fatigue beyond sleep. These are the timeless residues. They belong to no century in particular. They are the shared sediments of human experience, of power, of loss, of waiting, of ending. The night accepts them all equally. It makes no distinction between the end of a kingdom and the end of a day. Both are transitions into quiet. Both involve a letting go. The voice that speaks of these things now is itself becoming part of the quiet, slowing, deepening, allowing the words to space themselves further apart, until they are merely occasional sounds in a growing silence, like the last drops of water from a tapped vessel, each one a separate, distinct event in the stillness, until even that ceases, and there is only the listening silence itself, a vast, receptive space that has heard all this before and will hear it again, in different forms, forever, a soft, dark continuum where every story eventually returns, not to end, but to be absorbed, to become part of the silence from which the next whisper will eventually, softly, emerge.